So Craig had been covering a case that was going on in Scotland at the time, and it was extremely high profile. It was the former First Minister, which is essentially the highest political office in Scotland, Alex Salmond, had been accused by several women of having behaved sexually inappropriate. This was like a year and a half after the Me Too scandal started rising, and it kind of seemed to ride on that wave. And Craig was one of the reporters that went to the court, one of the few people that were let into the court in the first place, and one of the few people that wasn't just going to eat the mainstream coverage of it. There had been a leak that had come from the Crown, from basically the state side of it, leaks what is happening and that Alex Salmond is going to be charged. And after that initial leak, nobody is able to report on it. So Craig wrote a couple of blogs and went to quite some extent to double check that he wasn't identifying anybody, because the court had issued basically a warning saying, make sure that you guys don't identify any of the accusers and make sure that everything is safe. Craig had done that, but apparently, which wasn't quite clear to all of us until this became a high profile case, there is a law that deals with so-called jigsaw identification. And jigsaw identification means that people are meant to be able to identify something from a piece of information that you have put into the public sphere, if and only if they take it together with any other pieces of information out there in the public sphere. So essentially, this puts the onus and responsibility for knowing everything that is out in the public sphere and might lead to the identification of people that you might personally not even know into the hands of individual posters. Essentially, that suppresses any sort of coverage. You shouldn't be talking about it. You shouldn't be writing a blog about it. Don't text your ma about it. None of that, because nobody is reasonably able to oversee what information is out anywhere in the public in order to lead to the identification of people you might not have an idea about. It's sort of playing taboo without knowing the word that you're not supposed to name.
Wow, it's really Orwellian, this whole jigsaw thing. The jigsaw inside of a conundrum, inside of a riddle, inside of a Rubik's Cube. That's what it looks like to me, because I can't figure it out. But here he is languishing in jail. I mean, this is what, we all have we look at Scotland as, all right, they want their independence. I understand you want to get away from the Brits and all that, because we talked about this the other day, the Scottish Enlightenment, Robert Burns, you have Carlyle, all of these great writers. You think that now it would have gone into this era here in the 21st century, but this is a step backwards in terms of Scottish jurisprudence.
Oh, absolutely. It's such an ill-defined law in such an ill-defined way. And considering that in the Salmond case, the Scottish government was actually reprimanded for the way it had handled the complaints, and that their process was tainted by apparent bias, was the outcome by the judges. So that the details of the case are a lot to go into. But I think if you start looking at the headlines and you start realizing that the judiciary in Scotland and the government in Scotland are extremely close in a way that is extremely unusual for Western modern 21st century nations, and that the Scottish government has been reprimanded for how it's handled a complaint against a former First Minister under a law that was exclusively introduced to make that process happen. So a law that was introduced specifically about one First Minister in the past, with then eventually that whole thing coming down. Alex Salmond was not found guilty and so walked free, but obviously with a relatively tarnished reputation. The only thread that was still loose from that case was Craig Murray having covered it, and he was by far not the only person who covered it, nor the one who was most, brought most details to the case. I read pieces from the BBC in which I started to be able to identify people. I haven't been able to identify anybody from
None
Craig's
of those people are in
yet.
prison?
No, nobody has been charged either. None.
Well, that's because, it's their way of classifying what a journalist is. And there's nobody at the BBC who's a better journalist than Craig Murray. That's the That's the funny thing about this. He's the best journalist. There's no one at the BBC or the Guardian who can write as well
It
as
depends on
Greg.
how you're judging. I mean, in the BBC and in the British establishment, it's important to remember that obedience is more important than quality of writing. But